Good afternoon. I want to talk about the intertwined stories of the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain and Nostra Aetate. In so doing, I hope to give you a deeper appreciation of the context and the significance of this shortest of Vatican II's documents, now in its sixth decade as a milestone in Catholic-Jewish relations. In 1990, John Paul II, commemorating the 25th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, affirmed that Christian self-understanding is predicated on acknowledging and respecting Jews as a covenantal people. He used these words: "The Church is fully aware that sacred scripture bears witness that the Jewish people, this community of faith and custodian of a tradition thousands of years old," his emphasis, "is an intimate part of the mystery of revelation and of salvation," end quote. He credited a handful of pre-Vatican II Catholic writers such as Thomas Merton and Jacques Maritain with this insight. Now, Maritain is often cited as a bright spot in the Church's otherwise problematic history of relating to Jews and Judaism. In 1997, the French Catholic bishops issued a declaration of repentance at Drancy, site of the transit camp known as France's antechamber to Auschwitz. Here is part of what the French bishops said: "In the context of the debate which we now took place, why did the Church not listen to its best voices? On several occasions before the war, through articles and public lectures, Jacques Maritain endeavored to open Christians to another perspective on the Jewish people. He also forcefully warned about the perversity of the anti-Semitism which was developing." The bishops were lamenting their predecessors, their wartime predecessors' unwavering support for the collaborationist Vichy regime, which had cooperated with the Nazis in the final solution and which Maritain had vehemently opposed. Maritain also, during the war, helped inspire the French resistance with his wartime writings and radio addresses. But Maritain had not always stood on the side of the angels. He had converted to Catholicism in the first decade of the 20th century when France found itself roiled by the Dreyfus Affair, the bitter separation of church and state, and endless political squabbles that only partially subsided during the Great War. By the 1920s, this philosophy professor had found himself drawn to the ultra-nationalist rhetoric of the Action Française, an authoritarian and xenophobic movement that seduced many French Catholics with its promise to return the country to unity, tradition, and order. Though married to a Russian Jewish convert, Maritain lent his pen not only to anti-modern diatribes, but also an essential equation of modernity's ills with the Jews. Here's what he wrote in 1921. "It is necessary to add that an essentially messianic people, such as the Jews, from the instant when they reject the true Messiah, inevitably will play a subversive role in the world. Jews, Jewish intrigues, and the Jewish spirit can be found at the origin of most revolutionary movements in the modern era." End quote. In the late 1920s, after 1926, a papal condemnation of Action Française and its leader Charles Marat meant that Maritain had to choose between fidelity to the Church and his flirtation with proto-fascist doctrine. Pius XI directed the philosopher to draft a defense of the papal ban. Maritain obeyed the pontiff, burning his bridges with the extreme right and rethinking his political theology. Indeed, by the second half of the 1930s, Maritain solidified his reputation not only as one of the world's leading Catholic intellectuals, but also as an anti-fascist proponent of pluralism and human rights. His influential book, Integral Humanism, highlighted these characteristics of a new Christendom against the background of the rise of Nazism and, for Catholics, the bloody, divisive spectacle of the Spanish Civil War. As for his attitude toward Jews, he now thought it logically and morally impossible for a Christian to embrace anti-Semitism, given what he saw as the providential role of the Jewish people. And he wrote this in 1937. Whereas the church is assigned the task of the supernatural and supratemporal saving of the world, to Israel is assigned, in the order of temporal history and its own finalities, the work of the earthly leavening of the world. It teaches the world to be dissatisfied and restless so long as it has not God. It stimulates the movement of history. Maritain still saw the Jews as agents of ferment, but he had sanctified his thesis. As he put it, race, people, tribe, all these words used to describe them must be sacralized. End quote. Sacralization, in other words, treating something or someone as holy, entails mystery, and sometimes it can provoke hostility. More than one observer on the far right equated this kind of philo-Semitism with treason. The French fascist writer Lucien Rebatté let the venom drip freely, as you can see. He wrote, "Monsieur Jacques Maritain is married to a Jewess. He has Jewified his life. His doctrine and his theology are falsified like the passport of a Jewish spy." End quote. In the late 1930s, a general European war appeared more and more likely. Maritain sensed that the conflict would unleash a war of annihilation against the Jews. Here's what he said in a lecture in a Paris theater in 1938. "In order to fan the evil fire that consumes peoples, there are in the Europe of today those who want extermination and death, and first and foremost, the extermination of the Jews, because that really is what it comes down to, doesn't it? The insane hope for a general massacre of the race of Moses and Jesus," end quote. Now, when he made this speech in a public theater, some audience members tried to shout him down with cries of "paid for by the Jews" or "a Jew himself." Not only did Maritain prophesy the slaughter of European Jewry, but he also saw the ensuing Second World War in almost biblical terms, asserting in 1939 that, quote, "never before in the history of the world, were the Jews persecuted so universally, and never has persecution attacked, as today, both Jews and Christians." We can see here that we have entered upon an apocalyptic period of history. The events of 1940 further convinced him that, quote, "we have entered into the country of the apocalypse and of great sufferings," end quote. Maritain spent the wartime years of exile in New York City along with his wife Raisa and her sister Vera. Reports of mounting Nazi atrocities struck him as tantamount to a new crucifixion, this time of both Jesus and millions of his fellow Jews. He wrote in 1941 the following: "Jesus Christ suffers in the passion of Israel. In striking Israel, the anti-Semites strike him, insult him, and spit on him. To persecute the house of Israel is to persecute Christ," end quote. Maritain's embrace of the Pauline theology of the mystery of Israel led him to view suffering Jews, whom he called Christ's forgetful people, as participants in the economy of salvation. Yet he avoided a triumphalist equation of mass murder with somehow the mass conversion of the Jews. In fact, this Catholic's vision of a so-called Passion of Israel also drew on Jewish sources. These included Maurice Samuel's 1940 book, The Great Hatred, which identified Christophobia, as the author called it, as the driving force behind anti-Semitism. In other words, Jews are hated in large part because they gave the world the Christ, as well as the paintings of Maritain's close friend Marc Chagall, who for some years had developed a series of paintings where he portrayed the Jewish Jesus suffering with his persecuted people. Maritain's response to what he called the sacred horror of the Holocaust led him not only to oppose racist anti-Semitism, but also to rethink his church's, that is the Catholic Church's, teachings about Jews and Judaism. As a mentor to Father John Oesterreicher, a convert from Judaism who later served as one of the principal drafters of Nostra Aetate, Maritain admonished Oesterreicher to avoid recourse to anti-Jewish tropes in his exegesis. This is a letter that Maritain wrote to Oesterreicher during the war. He wrote, "The Acts, St. John, and St. Paul all speak of the Jews, because they were thinking primarily of the rejection of Christ by Israel as a mystical body, and subsequently characterized Jews in opposition to Christians who were themselves largely Jews in the beginning. For those of us who do not speak in an inspired language, but that of human and historical narration, I think that we must take care not to speak of the Jews in such a case, but of such and such Jews." In short, Maritain sought to subvert the kind of anti-Jewish presuppositions within the church that his contemporary, the French Jewish historian Jules Isaac, or in American English, Jules Isaac, later called the teaching of contempt. This toxic conglomeration of accumulated Christian prejudices not only identified Jews as stubborn, stiff-necked deniers of the Christ and followers of a dead, superseded religion, but also saw in them a reprobate, deicide race, Christ killers. In a 1944 article for the American Zionist journal Jewish Frontier, Maritain attacked this last deicide prejudice head-on. Here's what he wrote. "Who killed Christ? The Jews? The Romans? I have killed him. I'm killing him every day through my sins. There is no other Christian answer, since he died voluntarily for my sins and to exhaust the justice of God upon himself. Jews, Romans, executioners, all were but instruments, free and pitiable instruments of his will to redemption and sacrifice. That is what Christian teachers ought to inculcate in their pupils." End quote. Now, historians might identify this kind of statement as revolutionary, but it also reiterates what the church had taught in some of its better moments. For example, of all places, the 1566 Catechism of the Council of Trent, where we find the following. "This guilt seems more enormous in us than in the Jews, since according to the testimony of the Apostle Paul, if they had known it, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. While we, on the contrary, professing to know him, yet denying him by our actions, seem in some sort of way to lay violent hands upon him." End quote. One is reminded here that in some respects, Nostra Aetate, like other Vatican II documents, achieved progress by returning to the authentic sources of Christian belief. After the war, Maritain served as French ambassador to the Holy See, where he lobbied Pope Pius XII for a definitive condemnation of anti-Semitism on behalf of the church. He confided his fears and hopes to Papal Undersecretary Giovanni Battista Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, insisting that the fall of Nazism did not entail the demise of anti-Semitism. As he wrote to Montini, "The anti-Semitic psychosis has not vanished. I cannot stop myself from thinking that a proclamation of the true thought of the church would be simultaneously a work of enlightenment, striking down a cruel and harmful error, as well as a work of justice and reparation." End quote. An unsuccessful papal audience only left Maritain with what he called a heart-rending ambivalence regarding a pontiff who had told Maritain and who believed that he had already adequately addressed the matter of Christian prejudice against Jews. As we know, and in large part that's why we're here today, Pius XII's successor, John the 23rd, would revisit the question of Catholic-Jewish relations at the Second Vatican Council, largely at the personal urging of the aforementioned Jules Isaac. When Pope John died during the council, Pius's old undersecretary, who had long considered Maritain his teacher, ascended the papal throne as Paul VI. Maritain, now retired from the philosophy faculty at Princeton and living in a French monastic community, was summoned to Rome for the joyous close of the council. Despite this honor, Maritain privately bemoaned what he saw as a watering down of Nostra Aetate, which had undergone, as previous speakers have mentioned, which had undergone several drafts after attracting much theological and political controversy. So Maritain wrote to his friend Cardinal Journet, "I have suffered a real wound in seeing the words 'and condemns,' the church condemns, after the word decries, hatred, persecution, manifestations of anti-Semitism have been suppressed." So if you look at Nostra Aetate today, the 4th chapter, you will notice that the Catholic Church decries or deplores anti-Semitism, but the words condemn, the words "and condemns," that was removed in the process of those 5 drafts. Anyway, for Maritain, Nostra Aetate was an overdue but not complete repudiation of anti-Semitism by the church. Arguably, he died in 1973, he would have appreciated immensely the further steps taken by the church in decades to come, particularly during the momentous papacy of John Paul the Great. And he must have understood that this document, Nostra Aetate, constituted a momentous achievement, not just in historical time, but no doubt in the light of providence. For Maritain possessed something greater than just ecumenical tolerance. He had eschatological hope. With that in mind, I will let Maritain have the last word. God is patient. He does not charge the Jewish people with what Christians call their obstinacy and which Jews call their fidelity. Who would venture to say that in him, love gave way to the thirst for vengeance and reprobation? This would be blasphemy. Thank you.